Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to have you here for our Leaning into Conflict webinar. This program is being sponsored by Careers Advance, a private practice specializing in professional training and development. My name is Lisa Panarello. I'm the head of Careers Advance, and I will be your host. Two things before we get started. One, our program is being recorded, so you'll receive it next week to review and share. And you can also see past programs on Careers Advance YouTube channel. Secondly, for audio quality and just time constraints, everyone will be kept on mute except for our panelists. However, I want you to be involved, and I want you to take away tips that you can apply to your specific situation. We have participants on this call from HR, financial services, IT, healthcare, you name it. No doubt you interact with all types of people, employees, clients, coworkers, vendors. So I strongly encourage you to drop your personal questions in the chat box as they come up. Whether you want to direct it to everyone in the audience or you wanted to send it to me privately, get those questions in and we'll do our best to cover it. Okay, today we're speaking about conflict. And whether it's a simple lunch break disagreement or a full-fledged argument, conflict creates discomfort. And many of us, me included, ignore it. It's much easier. Unfortunately, feelings that are pushed below the surface can bubble up and manifest into full misunderstandings and resentment and even loss of self. Oddly enough, conflict doesn't have to be a bad thing. When handled effectively, conflict can lead to creativity, healthier relationships, even enhanced job performance. And that equates to personal and professional growth. So with those benefits in mind, today is about leaning into conflict instead of running away from it. So let's meet our panelists. Diana File. Diana is the principal of DF Analytics and Management Consulting. For the past 15 years, she has driven record-breaking results in analytics, research, organizational effectiveness, and conflict resolution for dozens of global corporations, educational institutions, and small businesses, including NASDAQ OMX, Inspire Human Resources, and Israel Defense Forces Department of Behavioral Sciences. Diana holds a degree in psychology from Yale University and a master's in psychology from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She speaks 4 languages. I barely speak English. I'm very impressed with that. And is the co-author of The Normalcy of Neurosis. Fun fact, she lives in Teaneck, New Jersey with her husband, 2 very rambunctious boys, and a very loud dog. Next up, Nora Simpson. Nora is the CEO of Simpson Strategic Solutions, a business strategy firm that offers a neuroscience-based approach to creating radical breakthroughs in revenue, profit, productivity, and fulfillment. Her work has helped more than 500 companies in 80 industries and over 20,000 individuals in addressing business and growth issues and resolving interpersonal conflict. Nora has delivered dozens of keynote speeches and workshops to organizations such as Merrill Lynch, Columbia Business School, and Indiana University. She's also the author of Get Ahead and Stay Ahead. Use the secrets of your own brain to unleash your success at work. And finally, Ted Gerber. Ted graced a previous webinar of mine on performance reviews, so I'm really excited to have him back. Ted is the president of Addison Resources Group, an organizational development consultant with over 25 years of diverse industry experience. He's coached C-suite executives and teams at Fortune 100 companies, as well as small to mid-sized firms across US, Canada, Europe, Latin America, and Africa. His particular specialties, is why I asked him to be here today, is conflict management, negotiation, influencing skills, and facilitation. Ted holds a master's degree in industrial relations from the University of Illinois and has been a frequent guest lecturer and instructor at colleges and universities, including NYU, Fairleigh Dickinson, and Cornell. All right, we've got a heavy topic here, so let's top into our panelist's brain. Ironically, that's actually the basis of my first question, actually. Understanding the brain. I think before jumping into how you can resolve conflict, I think it would be helpful to understand the science behind it, particularly what's going on in our brain and our bodies. So Nora, I want you to start us off here. What physiologically happens in our brain and our body when we are approached by or in the presence of conflict?
Such a great question, Lisa, and I'm so glad you're starting from the biology of it. Basically, in our brains, we have a lot of hormones and mechanisms that are designed to assess threat versus safety. And so there are actually more than 32 hormones that get triggered, like intensity hormones that get triggered in the fight or flight response. And when we feel ourselves rising in agitation around conflict, we tend to, have this very physical response. And that physical response is, most commonly identified with adrenaline, right? Adrenaline is the most common or the most famous hormone, right? As well as cortisol, which is the stress hormone. So what happens is that the adrenaline and the cortisol rise in our bodies, and we start to have rapid thinking. We start to have a kind of a mental fog. We tend to get a kind of, what's this word I'm looking for? Tunnel vision. There are all kinds of ways that our cognition gets compromised because this fight or flight response, which is these 32 hormones and everything, creates the ability for us to really look around for, great ways to escape the saber-toothed tiger, much more than it creates the ability to respond calmly and reasonably to a problematic situation.
So a lot's going on in that brain and body before we even say a word. I like to learn the science behind it. Diana, can you add more your thoughts on that particular area?
Yeah, piggybacking on what Nora said. So there's a lot of flooding of hormones in the brain, and one of the main ones is cortisol. And the cortisol flooding your brain creates what is called an amygdala hijack. The amygdala is part of the limbic system, the limbic brain, which is the primitive brain, we call it. It's shared with humans, share it with all animals. And so that's the part of our brain that goes back to that like caveman mentality of I got to save myself, I got to fight the threat. What happens when the amygdala is hijacked by cortisol is our brain shuts down what we call our executive functions. And that's the function that distinguishes us from other animals, which don't have it, where we do decision-making, logical thinking, critical thinking. We are able to strategize from that part of our brain, build trust, and experience compassion. So when that instinctive primitive part of our brain takes over, we are flooded with aggression and hostility, and we have to work against it to appease the brain and actually engage meaningfully with another person inside that conflict, which we'll get to later.
Yeah, I think you both just defined me, the hothead that I have to just to sort of smooth over before I respond.
We're all hotheads, Lisa. That's the magic. We're all hotheads.
Oh, that's great. Well, it's good to know a little bit of that science behind it. So that's a great place to start. So now let's go a little deeper. Conflict isn't always evidenced by a big blowout argument, and the motives behind the conflict could really be obscured or maybe even rationalized. So while each conflict is unique to the individual and the environment, there might be sort of some common threads to watch out for. So Diana, continue off here with us. To help us increase our awareness, can you describe maybe the most common underlying psychological factors that can cause conflicts, particularly in the workplace?
Yeah, happy to. So my research on conflict resolution, I mostly did it in the Middle East, but I piggybacked on a lot of the research that was done all over the world. And the 5 psychological factors that were found as most prominent, and I will get into them, are factors relevant to the way an in-group perceives an out-group, or us versus them, or myself versus the other. So these are factors that describe the way I perceive the relationship between myself or my in-group versus the other party. The 5 factors are superiority, so the sense that I am better than, or my group is better than the other group. Injustice, the sense that something has happened to wrong me or my group at the hands of the other. Distrust, so again, going back to that amygdala hijack where we can't trust the other person or the other party because we're suspicious of them. Vulnerability, right? We feel at risk, we feel threatened, and helplessness. We feel powerless to sort of do anything about it. And these 5 factors are called by the researchers who codified them, Edelson and Edelson, about 20 years ago, they're called the 5 dangerous beliefs, because the more then there's like scales and all kinds of ways to measure this. The more you score highly on these measures, the more you have any of these kinds of belief systems, the more you perpetuate the conflict. It's more intractable. There's more hostility in the relationship.
It's good sometimes to actually define it, almost knowing what to look for, which is behind the actual conflict itself. So Tay, can you add to this? I mean, you mediate conflicts all the time. It's what you do for a living. So are these the types of common factors that you're seeing? Is there any one that sort of overshadows the other in your experience?
I don't know if one overshadows the other. I mean, those I think are in many cases the output of that happens or that you have to address. I take it from the perspective that, at least the conflicts I've been involved in, the organization itself, there's sometimes, in terms of the structure, sometimes if you're working in an organization, that structure can provide tension and conflict just by the structure. What I mean by that is you can have, for example, the classic one is a sales operations. You have a sales group, you have an operations group that's got to deliver what the salespeople sell. Salespeople have a certain perspective on what the goals of the organization are, and so do the operations people. And sometimes there's a clash. And that's based on the structure, and that in a lot of organizations exist. Or you may have sales and marketing still working towards a similar goal, but coming at it from different perspectives. So structurally and functionally, sometimes you'll have conflicts inherently built into the organization.
Okay.
Sometimes it's also a question of styles. You know, I've been involved in situations where one person is very analytical, let's say, and the other is much more, you know, if you use the Myers-Briggs kind of terminology, much more feeling or relationship oriented. Those styles are going to clash, especially when they come at a problem from different perspectives. And sometimes too, it's related to the personalities of people. You know, people have different personalities, and one might be more aggressive and the other's more laid back, and you're going to have these kinds of tensions arise. So they come up in many different ways. I think the output is a lot of the things that was mentioned by Diana, you know, in terms of how that all plays out.
Yeah, when I'm learning about, and I think this will be another topic for down the road in terms of emotional intelligence, it all stems from how we grew up, which will probably come into part of this conversation in a minute. Well, thanks for that. So now let me get back to my screen share here. So it's good to know sort of what's sort of brewing behind it. Those are some of the causes to be aware of. Now I'd like to understand how to really determine, because you brought it up here, Ted, like where the conflict really lies. There are the fundamental types of conflicts. Typically it's between me and you, person to person. Sometimes the conflict could be internal. You're struggling with yourself. Maybe it's with the organization, work or a church that you belong to, and it could be the job or the task you're involved in. Nora, what questions can we ask ourselves or tactics that we can use to really uncover where the issue lies before we try to solve it?
Such a great question. You know, so I teach this neuroscience-based approach where I really try to give people like a user manual for the brain, right? And one of the first things that I teach all my clients is, and I shouldn't say I teach it, actually Diana teaches it too. Diana and I often work together on this stuff, and it is such a pleasure to watch Diana using these tools, and she uses them so effectively with people. So I'm really glad that I'm really honored that I have someone so skillful and intelligent as Diana, also, teaching this methodology that I was blessed to create. So something that Diana and I both do with our clients is, we really invite them to seek out a skill set around awareness, internal awareness of discomfort first and foremost, before we do any engagement with resolution. Because discomfort compromises our entire perception of the situation. And if we are unaware of our discomfort will bring a lot of the factors Diana was talking about: superiority, injustice, vulnerability. It will bring those things to the fore in our brains in ways that will usually strengthen the sense of disagreement between people. But if we can begin to dial in and say, well, before I do anything else, let me be aware of this discomfort. And honestly, it can sound a little hippy-dippy, but let me be kind to this discomfort. Let me be warm and welcoming to this discomfort. Let me not try to get rid of this discomfort. because when we're honoring and kind to the discomfort starts to settle down. If we tell the discomfort to go away, and this is one of the tricks I've found in a lot of self-aware people, there are folks who know there's a problem, but they try to suppress the problem. They go, oh, this is a problem, let me suppress it. And unfortunately, that actually strengthens the discomfort and the rise of hormones. And when we strengthen that rise of hormones, we actually fall prey to the superiority and injustice issues just as much as if we didn't even have awareness of them.
It kind of touches what you just said on a personal thing for me, because I can often have guilt for having a feeling. I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't feel about this person this way. But it is, feelings aren't necessarily right or wrong. So to honor them and just say, okay, it's okay, but let's understand why. So I appreciate you allowing me to honor whatever feeling I have.
Lisa, can I just say, feelings are never wrong.
Right. No, they're never right or wrong.
Like
exactly.
never, ever, ever, ever.
Yeah.
Like it's okay to, like, your feelings are like the weather. Would you get mad at the rain? Would you get mad at the sun? Like, they just happen.
Yeah, no, it's true. So I got to sort of rid the guilt of it. So Ted, now in your mediation, how are you helping them, your clients, to understand and realize where the conflict lies before they approach it? What are some of your techniques?
Well, I think one of the first things, and this sounds kind of crazy, is to first have, if it's two parties involved, could be groups, could be individuals, is to recognize that there is a conflict. Now that sounds kind of crazy, because it's difficult to resolve a conflict if one person says basically, well, I don't see it. I don't see a conflict. I don't see any tension. I don't see any problem. So it's got to be a recognition that we do have an issue here, or problem, a tension, or something that needs to be resolved. And to me, then it's about thinking about, why is that issue there? What is driving it? In an organizational sense, it might be, again, what are some objectives each group is trying to achieve that might be clashing with each other? So what is the root cause of driving the particular behaviors people have towards each other? Because you've got to get at that. Because I've seen a lot of situations where people address conflict on a very superficial level because they don't like the idea of conflict. So let's paper it over and make sure it goes away, but it doesn't go away. So until you get at the root cause of issues, and I can think of one example where two executives were at odds with each other, and the CFO of the company said, basically, if they don't resolve this, they're going to be out. And what it turned out to be, as I probed it and we got to the root cause of where the whole conflict started from in the first place, was one of those executives was out of work that day, and the other guy made the decision without consulting that executive, but the other executive never said anything about it. And so this tension was there, and it exploded in many different ways between the two of them. And until they sat down in a room, and it was a whole process we went through, but until they started talking about where it all came from and got that on the table, they were not able to resolve it. Once they put that out there, it was a whole misunderstanding that drove this behavior that lasted for 6 months, that almost cost them their jobs. So it's the recognition that we have it. Why is it there? What's the root cause? And then ultimately, what are the goals we're trying to achieve between us that we are required to work together to reach, where this conflict can get in the way?
I appreciate that simplicity of it all, that it can start with just simply recognizing, acknowledging that the conflict exists. Cool.
By the way, it's the first yes. If you read the book, Getting to Yes by Roger Fisher, that's a first yes. Do we have a conflict? Yes.
Oh, do me a favor, write that book and any of our panelists, if you have books on the subject, put that in the chat box if you wouldn't mind, Ted, and because I'll take a look at those and I can always add that to my follow-up message for folks. Thank you. All right, so that's some good stuff on understanding what's going on behind the scenes. So now let's look at typical responses to conflict. And Diana, you've helped me become aware of this. I mean, I knew of a couple, but not the other two. So as far as I've learned, that as humans, we are naturally programmed to respond to danger in one of 4 ways: fight, flight, freeze, or appease. Now, obviously, some conflicts aren't necessarily dangerous. We're not always in the park getting mugged, but even small ones can be uncomfortable just the same. So you might use some of these techniques, these responses. So Diana, are there any workplace circumstances where these types of responses are appropriate, or will they always sort of leave us unsatisfied?
I was muted.
Diana, you're on mute.
It's funny, the Zoom thing actually alerts me, so it knows when I'm talking. Yeah, that was a wonderful overview. So flight, fight, freeze, and appease. Those are definitely the most common ones. fight, we keep arguing the point. Flight, revert to and hide behind group consensus. Freeze, you disengage from the argument and shut down. And appease, you pretend to agree. So that's those are the four main responses. It's useful to go back to what Ted said earlier about organizations and the way they're designed for people to be in conflict with each other. It's important to remember that everybody has a part to play. The reason conflict exists and that is that there's a need for healthy tension between certain interests in any kind of system, in any kind of interaction among different people. So you have the salespeople in an organization who want to sell a product and they want to go and create client serving needs. And then you've got the risk and the compliance people in the organization who are there to basically stop them if they're doing something that could get them into trouble. There's a healthy tension there, right? The salespeople need to be driven to go, because if they were stuck in the risk mentality, they would be so afraid they wouldn't be able to go selling. And the risk people need to be there and be able to point out all the problems, right? And those two don't often coexist in the same role or in the same person. So it's useful to note that all of these responses are part of the cycle of, getting into conflict and then resolving it in a healthy way, which actually then strengthens the outcome. And so, the other thing to point out here is that as much as we think fighting is uncomfortable or we think confronting a conflict is uncomfortable, there is an addictive element to fight. So fighting floods your brain with hormones like adrenaline, dopamine, which are the same hormones that flood your brain when you take a drug or do any other kind of addictive substance. It gives you a sense of high, a sense of dominance.
Or you're having sex. You could be having sex or fighting. Don't fight with your spouse. Just have sex. Okay.
And so it gives you a sense of dominance and invincibility. And so that's why people say, like, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy, right? Like there is a sense of feeling happy or high in a moment of arguing. If you've ever been on Facebook or Twitter and been stuck in an online argument with someone, and certainly other situations, you can get the sense of why that is. And so that sort of explains why conflict persists and why the tendency to fight persists. But the problem is that creates a zero-sum game. So while one person is getting high off the sense of their dominance, others are being drummed into submission, which then diminishes their ability to collaborate and connect with others. And fight, flight, freeze, appease just doesn't foster honest, productive, and open sharing of information and opinions. So we'll talk about the alternative later, but this was just the question about why it's bad, right? Why
exactly. Yeah, just understand, those particular four types of responses. So you've kind of clarified the why they happen, so I appreciate that. And we'll get more into the resolution in a minute. Because I really just wanted to start half this conversation off with understanding. So Ted, your thoughts on the benefits or the negative aspects of these fight, flight, freeze, and appease responses. What do you bring to the table on that?
There's another way I've heard that framed, and it's through the Thomas Kilmann instrument, which is they talk about the 5 styles of conflict management. But to me, and one of them is collaboration. And the other is, compromise and being competitive, which is sort of the fight, and then accommodating and avoiding. Okay, those are the 5. And to me, what I always tell people is the strategic approach is to be collaborative, which means basically that you're going to get your needs met, but they also have to have something come out of the process as well. It cannot just be you dominating them basically and getting what you want and they don't get anything. But yet there are times, so that's strategically where you should be, from the collaborative box, so to speak. But there are times when it's okay from a conflict management on a tactical level to avoid, to withdraw, to accommodate. I'll give the accommodation, for example. If you have a customer that's your largest customer, responsible for 60, 70, 80% of your business, and they make a demand on you, which causes conflict for you to fulfill that demand, there are times when you might accede to that demand, knowing that they're wrong, because your goal is to preserve the long-term relationship. So I may be willing to accommodate tactically that one time. I'm not going to do it all the time, because then it puts me in a very bad position. But there are things you have to think about in terms of, should I tactically avoid or be more competitive, to push back more versus giving in? But again, on a strategic level, I want to be from a collaborative place, meaning I want to get my need met, they got to get their need met or needs met. The other thing is, at least when I've coached people who are having problems in dealing with somebody else from a conflictual issues or tensions or what have you, is it's easy to point the finger at the other person and say it's all because of them. And I like to say to them, look in the mirror. You know, what is your accountability for this conflict to continue? You know, it's not all a one side, it's both people have an accountability here. And once you get that recognition, it's about what can I do to change my approach, and then we'll get to that later on, and how I address the issue with them versus, because if I see them as it's all their fault, it's very hard for me to resolve conflict with them. Because I have a story in my head about this bad person or what have you, and I'm just not, you know, willing to accede to anything.
Well, thank you, Ted, for giving me, what's the word I'll use, permission to fight, flight, appease, or freeze when it's necessary. So there are some, you know, especially in the world of business. So thank you. No, I appreciate that.
I'm applying it to the world of business, but even it's true, even on a personal level. Sometimes.
Right. Sure. Well, what you've all just given us now, at least for me anyway, is a strong understanding of the science behind conflict and some of our response mechanisms. Now we're going to get into the meat. We're going to move on to resolution strategies. And this is where I expect some audience questions, because I want you to walk away with some specific tactics that you can apply. So as we go through the next half hour and you're listening, I need you to think about what's going on in your world, at the office or at home, and put that situation into the chat, again, to everyone, or just directed to me if you want to be private. I won't call out names, so that I can present that situation to our panelists and they can give us feedback on how to handle that. So I really encourage questions from here on out. All right. Now, excuse me, this next part is about looking at solutions. So when we just, like you said before, Nora, feelings and opinions are neither right nor wrong. Yet we often enter conflict at a place of defense, like we've got to defend our position. Well, Nora, what are some practical techniques that can help us, to use your word, Ted, accept our own role in the conflict without feeling like we've already lost?
Absolutely. Well, so one of my favorite mind tricks with my clients is to take people out of defense and even offense and get them into embracing and appreciating. So that wonderful slide you were showing with the fight, flight, freeze, appease, you know, what's great about each one of those tactics is that they're actually really, really useful sometimes, right? Depending on the context, every trait in human beings can show up as an asset, and every trait in human beings can show up as a liability, right? So one thing I ask them to do is I say, you know, Ted is absolutely right that you have to tell people to look in the mirror, but sometimes I find that it's easier to get them to look in the mirror when I say, you know, there's this wonderful thing that you're doing here. Let's list all the wonderful ways, you know, that that your response is showing up. Let's list all the special positive things about them. And sometimes people need help with that because when they feel, you know, threatened and victimized, they don't actually even know how to look for the positives in themselves, right? But I think that actually really helps bring the hormonal response down a little bit, to be reminded of like how much power and how much capacity they're demonstrating, even in their conflicted state. And then from there, we can start to examine what the wonderful traits are about the other person who is doing some crazy stuff, obviously, or else you wouldn't be complaining about them, right? Like, where does this work? Where does this work for them? Where does this work for you, right? Like, you know, the risk management people are telling you there's not enough data in the customer's, you know, application for blah, blah, blah. You know, where has this protected you from lawsuits? Where has this helped you? Where has this guy done you a solid? And look, he's just doing what he does. So before we even get to proposals for compromise, why don't we just turn the heat down a little bit by really appreciating that both sides are bringing assets, you know, that sometimes work and sometimes don't. And Lisa, I noticed someone in the chat talking about living with very critical in-laws.
Yeah, I'm going to throw that out there. Yeah. So we do have a question, so I'll throw it out to you. So we have an audience member who says, I've got in-laws I'm living with. They're critical about everything. And even though I work, I'm expected to be available and everything they ask for. And the criticizing gets me upset. And I speak back and it gets ugly. So how can you advise her on, Mary, on sort of working that out a little bit?
So the first thing I want to say to you, Mary, is good for you for standing up for yourself. Good for you for knowing that you deserve to be treated well. That's actually a skill set not everybody has. And some folks actually have to work for many years to even find their voice in knowing that they deserve to be treated well. And it's a really big thing that I've seen a lot of people work years to even get to that place. So the fact that you're already there is fantastic, right? The thing that I'm hearing is that the sort of consistent experience of criticism is wearing down the energy that you have to deal with these people's fear and pain and problems and whatever else. And so it's just magnifying the part of you that knows to stand up for yourself, the part of you that knows you're valuable. It's magnifying your irritation that you have to keep standing up for yourself. Does that make sense? What I would say is that these people, however it is that they're being critical, my guess is that their criticism is coming from some kind of fear, some kind of sense of scarcity. Those tend to be the two main reasons that people respond with negativity to each other, right? They either feel like they don't feel safe enough or you're not giving them enough of your resources. You might just try saying something along the lines of, when they expect you to be available, oh my gosh, I wish I could help you with this right now. I'm in the middle of something else. I will be with you, and then give them a specific time, because it might just be a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear that you don't care that is motivating their criticism. I'm not saying you have to feel 100% authentic the first time you say it. It might feel like you have to fake it till you make it, but it's totally cool to experiment with it and just see what happens if you give them a specific time, basically manage their expectations and affirm that you want to be there for them, right? In a way that works for you so that your boundaries and your needs are met first. Because if you don't take good care of yourself, you can't be present for anybody else. So that's my advice.
And I'll piggyback off that, off the stuff about needs, right? So one of the findings in my work about building peace and creating resolutions to longstanding intractable conflicts is that we have to start from the bottom up, and the bottom is the human. Because often, like when I studied international conflicts, often the solutions that fail are the ones that are top down, and they're guiding people to sign agreements about, national boundaries and policies. And in an organization, that could be a client who wants to, create a change in the organization, and the CEO or the C-suite person really wants to, change to a certain software or a certain product strategy, but they haven't actually checked in with what the needs are, the people's needs are who are actually going to be implementing that software change or product change. Same with the diplomats who might not be checking in with the people or not be in tune with the people who are actually, grassroots going to be affected by the change. And so conflict resolution from a peace perspective really requires meeting the unfulfilled needs on all sides, and the assumption that if people are in conflict, then someone's needs aren't being met in some way, shape, or form. And those could be material needs for housing, food, shelter, any other sort of basic need that there is in the physical world. And it could be psychological needs for identity, needs for security and safety. We all have those needs. And the reason that, the conflict is persisting is someone's needs are unfulfilled. And so the lens that I always guide my clients to look through is, what does this other person need? And what do you need in order to succeed in overcoming this and getting through it? It could be you need more support, you need more resources. It could be you need more information and more knowledge. And Nora and I teach a framework that includes these 4 elements. It could be support, vision, it could be clarity, that's the information piece, and it could be structure. Like maybe I just don't have accountability or a sense of how the sequence of tasks that need to happen. And then I get mad at the other person, but I maybe haven't voiced my needs in the way that they can hear them. So there's a lot of opportunity for resolution to communication breakdown as well. And part of that is just learning to listen and learning to see what the person really needs, even if they're not able to vocalize it.
I was just going
No,
to
go
add
ahead, Tim.
just an interesting story about sort of framing, when you go into a conflict, framing your mindset around the other person. And I did this exercise years ago. I was working with a senior management team, and the CEO was in the training. It was a behavioral-based leadership training. I was with another company at that time. And he was staring me right at the head of the U table, staring at me and giving me a very dirty look from the beginning, sort of like, what are you going to tell me that I don't already know? And at one point in the training, we had him do this exercise. And the exercise was, I want you to think of somebody you don't like. And everybody said, yeah, I got somebody in mind. I said, good. Now I want you to write down 10 positive points about that person. Now, it was interesting. When I said to do that, he pounded the table and in no uncertain terms said to me, this is a BS exercise. He says, I could write down 10 positive points about a mass murderer. What does it prove? Now, I said to him, that's a very good question, but let's leave the mass murderer part out for the moment. I said, suppose you were trying to influence, negotiate, or resolve an issue with somebody where when you walked in that room, every pore in your body said, I can't stand you. How successful do you think you would be? He said to me, I see your point, and I never had an issue with him after that. Because the point was framing, we all tend to look at the other person in a negative light in a conflict. How do I start framing it from a more positive place? Not for them so much, but for me and how I interact, to control my emotions more, to listen more, to ask good questions. All of that is a prelude in a sense of having good intent about the situation and the person. And I can't have that if I can't stand them, so to speak. And all I have is negativity. And that's my filter towards them.
Well, to sum up,
And
all
also,
of that,
if you write down,
sorry, go ahead.
if you write 10 things, if you write down 10 good things about a mass murderer, maybe you'll actually start to like engage with criminal justice reform. You know, like maybe there's something to be learned from having a more holistic view of human beings. You know,
You just say nobody was able to write down 10 positive things. So, but that's okay. If you can write down one or two, that's okay. You know? So.
Well, you've all given us a nice sort of narrowing, summing up framework, ask questions, actively listen, sort of three sort of steps to the resolution part. And we have a question. I want to come back to you, Diana, and I'm paraphrasing here. What if you work with someone who is passive aggressive? And a lot of them on the team do not like working with this person, just like you're saying, Ted. And I'm told that from senior management that they need to work with this person. So I feel torn. I'm in the middle as I have to keep the team working cohesively. So what advice can you give to our audience on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd want to know what the situation is and what how the passive aggressive behavior manifests itself. You know, is there a fear of speaking out? Is there a lack of skill set in how to ask for what I need? Or is it in that specific person, is it an individual issue? Or is there a structural problem where the organization doesn't provide avenues for that person to speak up? But, you know, I think going back to, it is uncomfortable working with different kinds of people. People have different styles and we have to meet people where they're at, because trying to wish somebody was different or change them isn't going to work. I have no power to change anyone but myself. And so I've definitely worked with my share of passive aggressive personalities. Nora can attest to that too. And it's challenging, you know, like but I also believe like I get put in places in my life by some higher force that will teach me skills, right? So what can I learn from this situation? And how can I maybe talk to this person one-on-one and just be like, hey, I noticed I might be totally off base, but you seem to be feeling uncomfortable and I felt some, you know, tension in this conversation. Can we talk about it? What's really going on? I think it might be this, that, the other thing. Just get the person to open up and maybe create that safe space for them.
You know, it's interesting. I just add, there's a recent article in the Harvard Business Review, which I thought was sort of on point. It's called Persuading the Unpersuadable. And the article talks about different methods that people utilize in persuading somebody like Steve Jobs, who was very difficult to persuade. And I would recommend the article. It's very good, on target to a lot of what we're talking about here. So anyway.
Excellent.
I wanted to chime in on the passive aggression thing. Jennifer, you know, when I was in my 20s, I had a very dear friend who called me passive aggressive on a very regular basis. And I think of myself as a very direct communicator, but I'm 40 now, so maybe I've grown. I remember that there was this aha moment for me around passive aggressive behavior, where I realized that when other people called me passive aggressive, what was happening on the inside for me was that I was angry or upset. I was hiding it, and I thought I was hiding it effectively, and I was wrong. And that was a big deal for me to realize. So I think it would be really interesting to me to hear more about what the actual behaviors are. Like, is it like little snide comments? Is it like actual sabotage? I worked with a company where like there was actually like this lady like destroying people's PowerPoints. Like, it was really problematic, right? That's a different thing from, saying nasty opinions or just making, little put downs like at the end of a meeting or something. But all of these things can be discussed if we come from a warm, positive, affirming place. I do believe that people fundamentally want to grow their skill sets. The question becomes how, for me with this person, the question would be, how can you contextualize the journey around this particular issue around a growing of skill set?
That's a skill I've been working on now for a year, because I often can be very defensive, and I don't like that. I don't want to just make it that I'm right or I can't be wrong. So I really worked at the technique of wanting to know why you said that, what it means to you, why does that bother you? So I'm getting better at it. I've still got a lot to go, but I'm asking those questions so I can come from that warm place of, I want to know, so that I don't get defensive again, or I don't respond in that unhealthy way again. So being more about finding out about them, so then I can open up the space to talk about me. Before we just move on, Ted, that article you just mentioned, Persuading the Unpersuadable, we have an audience member that asked the source of that. So if you know where it is.
The current issue of the Harvard Business Review.
Harvard Business Review. There you go.
Right. I would just want to add one thing to what was just said, because I think it's very important. When I used to do mediation work as a full-time job many years ago. And to be effective in that role, we used to have a saying. And the saying was, to be effective in a third-party role, you had to be like a duck in water. Because you would get attacked from both sides, so to speak, because you'd be transmitting messages back and forth, and they'd be pointing fingers at you if they didn't like the message. And that was part of the job and part of the role. You had to take the flak. We said that if you were like that duck in water, because water rolls off the duck's back, you had that mindset. You could not personalize any attack on you, because then you would jeopardize your ability to help them resolve the issue, because then it would be personalized. So I always remember that, and it's not easy to do when you're in the midst of as you said, the brain takes over, so to speak. But if you can get to that point of saying, I'm like the duck in water here, and it's going to go over my back, and focus. And usually when people sense that, now we can focus more on resolving the issue versus getting involved with all the emotions, which we get involved in a lot in a conflict situation.
Oh, that's an interesting technique. Oh, and Larry, thank you very much. He just posted actually the link to the article. So anyone wants it, just grab it from there. I do have one other question from an audience member before I move on. And again, I'm paraphrasing here. So the audience member writes, during a meeting last week, there was a manager who ripped apart details on a presentation slide. I don't know if they knew it was my research or not, but my colleagues knew. The information was correct. Should I address it in the meeting or pull the manager aside later? And either way, what do I say? Diana, you want to take that one?
Yeah, that's happened to me. And it's not fun. So I would first just say, listen, I'm sorry that happened to you. And there is definitely an opportunity, to learn to stand up for yourself there. Question would be, if it happens, if it should happen one-on-one or in a group. I think, you really have to navigate the situation. Sometimes these kinds of aggressive personalities are best deflected with a little like sarcastic remark or joke in the meeting. But, depending on your position vis-a-vis that person and how much they're sensitive to embarrassment, you may want to take it offline later and be like, hey, that wasn't cool. I wasn't comfortable with what just happened. I don't know if you know how it felt for me, but I just wanted to share with you what my experience was, and then share, that this is, what happened for you. I think it's important to say no one wakes up in the morning wanting to hurt another person. And any kind of conflict, again, comes from passion between different people. So I like to say, I lived in Jerusalem for a long time. It's the city, it's the holiest city to the three worlds, the three of the major religions in the world. And the reason they're all fighting is because it's so holy for them, right? Like, and it's the same thing in a company. It's so important to, meet a company's strategic priority. The only reason people get passionate about something is because, or in conflict or heated about something, is because they're passionate about it. So, yeah, I mean, I would want to talk to you further, maybe offline, if you would want to reach out, and then we could discuss the details where it would be appropriate to go, one-on-one versus in a group.
Sure. I mean, there's so many questions that would benefit from the one-on-one, and I'll mention that later before we close. And so I appreciate that perspective. I've got one more question of mine to ask, but the floor is still open. So if more questions come to you, please throw it in the chat. All right. Next, I kind of want to look a little forward.
Lisa,
Yes.
I think maybe Ted and I probably each wanted to talk about the person who had the tear down in the meeting too.
Sure,
Did you want to, Ted?
Go right
No,
ahead.
I was just going to say that I think that the issue does need to be addressed, because it's like when I'm coaching somebody, the first step when you do a 360 to get feedback on an executive when you're coaching them is to create awareness. Nothing will change unless this person is aware that is a problematic behavior. Because if they're not aware, they're going to continue to do it. So I think it does have to be addressed, I think privately, not in the meeting. I think you run a risk in meetings to do things like that, because the person can get defensive and feel their position is being threatened in some way. But privately, I think to follow up, and I think as you were saying, Diane, I think follow up the way you described it on one-on-one is an appropriate way to go. Absolutely.
Great. Nora, you said
I
yes.
also, yeah. I also think that there is an element of like plugging into the tribe a little bit, like the tribe at work, and really kind of picking your battles as well. So here's what occurred for me. Somebody who's tearing down a slide filled with correct facts. Again, I would want more detail to know what was going on, but it could be that that person was tearing down the formatting of the slide, not necessarily the facts, right? Like, there's a lot of ways to be really like unnecessarily critical. And I've seen it, I've seen very powerful people exhibit a kind of obsession and perfectionism around things that seemingly don't matter at all. But that I believe that when people exhibit that level of obsession or perfectionism, they're usually speaking from a lot of fear. And of course, remember, the higher up you are in an organization, the more swords there are pointed at you, right? And the more people, people who you work for say, you didn't do that, well, go handle it. They don't sit there and go, what could I do to support you, blah, 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 right? So I would say it's really useful to first and foremost, again, add context and be like, what is this person's deal? Like, are they someone who's always just going to find somebody to moan about in the meeting? And this week it was me. Do they have a personal vendetta against me? Do they have a personal vendetta against people who look like me, who sound like me, stylistically, ethnically, gender-wise, whatever? And also understand that, sometimes it's not about going to HR and filing a grievance. Sometimes it's not about, starting the uncomfortable conversation and having it fall on deaf ears. I have a client who is a very, very high-level coronavirus researcher working at one of the most elite medical institutions in the country. And she talks about that basically, like, her staff meeting can't start until, like, the joke in her group is that her staff meeting can't start until their boss says a racist comment. Like, it's so well known within the office tribe that this guy is a dinosaur, Oh wow, who's talking about power games and chessboards? So there's an element, I think, of being strategic and being thoughtful about this. And maybe you just gather connectedness and tribal support for a while, and bide your time, because if this person isn't available for feedback, if this person is on a big power trip or a big fear trip, which a lot of the times those two trips are the same, right? Then, addressing it directly might just put you in a bad position. And so I would just say, be really thoughtful, be really strategic, and try as hard as you can not to take it personally, even if it has your name on it.
Well, adding on
that,
to
I mean, that,
the one of the
go
questions
ahead, Lisa.
about the passive aggressive, what if I ask directly to learn about the concern and the person denies any feelings? Where do you go from there for that type of situation, our audience says?
Absolutely. So if we're talking about Jennifer's question, if that person says like, oh no, everything's fine, it's all fine, you know, then you just have to kind of go, you know, like, okay, just wanted to check, right? And then maybe wait a week or two. And if the behavior persists, which my guess is that it will, like take them aside and say, hey, I'm glad everything's fine for you, but I've gotten some feedback from 3 different people that there are these ways that you probably don't know you're coming off as unkind. You know, you don't want to use words like passive aggressive because it's a very confrontational word. But if you say, you know, I've gotten some instances of times when you've come off as unkind, and I'd like to give you some coaching on just how to be kinder, because it's important that we're kind to each other as we work on this stuff together. Things like that, I think, you know, keeping it really specific, particular, keeping it out of the psychobabble terms and in the kind of like basic human decency terms, and saying, you know, if you ever feel like anyone's been unkind to you, I want to know, you know, that kind of thing. I find can generally be more, it's more accessible for folks, is my experience.
Lisa, could I just interject one thing?
Yeah, if you could quickly, because then I've got a question I want to throw to Diana. Yep.
If a situation like this arises, I look at it this way. You've got 4 basic choices here. 1, I can address it because my need is not being met and I got to address it. It's bothering me. 2, I could make a choice to let it go, meaning basically in the total scheme of the universe, let's assume this happened once, I'm not going to pursue it anymore. Maybe the person had a bad day, what have you. Okay, so that's a second choice. Third choice is it bothers me so much and I've tried to confront it before or address it before, but it never worked out. So I'm going to leave. I'm going to leave the organization. I've had it. Okay, that's a third choice. Now, it's a pretty draconian choice. Fourth choice is I can pretend to resent and basically say everything's wonderful and play passive aggressive. I always like to say to people, I'd like you to focus on the first 2 choices. Either address it or make the choice to let it go. And in the total scheme of things, it's not that important, at least at this time. Because if you play the other way, leave is a pretty draconian choice. And if you go pretend resent, that's where passive aggressive comes in. That's where it becomes very difficult. And people are going to read that, to Nora's point, they're going to see that after a while. So I tend to lean on address it. That's where I go first.
Well, that kind of,
with all due respect, that sounds like a very privileged answer, you know. I think there's a lot of people in situations where they have a lot more choices at their disposal than those 4. And, you know, for me personally, like I remember a time before I was a business owner when I had a coworker who was constantly asking me to do his work and turned out to be lying about things, like would come to me and say, you know, our boss told me these things about you, told me that he's mad at you, you know, and I would say, oh, you know, maybe I should get our boss in here and apologize. Maybe he's upset. Oh my gosh. And what I learned to do was not let it go and not address it directly with him, because neither of those were going to work. What I learned to do was keep myself careful, like stay careful, stay aware, set healthy boundaries. And eventually the whole group of people we worked with caught on, and that man was fired. So I wasn't in a position to leave. I wasn't in a position to address the grievance. I wasn't sure if what he was saying about our boss being angry with me was true or not true. I had no idea. And so there were a lot of vulnerabilities, and I just had to kind of I wasn't letting it go because it was constant, you know, it was every other day. Something was, you know, a volcano. And all I could do was say, I'm going to pray for this man's soul. I'm going to stay in my lane. I'm going to do the best job I can do. And I'm gonna, you know, like have healthy boundaries and let him try to get other people to do his work for him. And he was gone within 6 months, but they were a very uncomfortable 6 months. After the 6 months was over, I went around and did a resolution tour and said, you know, so Rob, did you say any of this to Joel? You know, and he was like, what? No, but it was too risky to be so direct. at that stage. So I think there is something to be said for like playing the chessboard, not letting the resentment destroy you, right? But understanding that you're in a high conflict, difficult situation, and the answer might not always be, oh yeah, it's black, it's white, or nothing. You know?
I just want to be clear. When I say address, I'm not saying you should march into the person's office that minute and have a conversation. There's some fact finding I may have to do. I may have to get some help from others, get some advice from others on how the best way would be to approach this person. I have to think about the timing. I once worked for a guy when I was doing the negotiations work that said something very interesting. He said, good negotiations, which is what this is about in a sense, is just like sex. It's all in the timing. So the timing of it is also important. So I didn't want to leave people like, you should go up right away and confront the person. That's not what I'm saying. It's like,
no, I think you're all offering tactics that we have to try. No, I'm sure she didn't know that she meant that, but we're all learning different tactics that we do have to try. So I do want to, Diana, for you to answer this last audience question, maybe in under a minute if you can, because it has to do with a little bit of the change behavior, which is coming off what you guys are sharing. So I have a coworker who I've lost respect for, which causes tremendous conflict. So what's a good first step in knowing that it's unlikely this person will change their behavior? So how does someone resolve that conflict when they know they can't change their behavior? 1 minute.
I think it's a great question. A good first step, take a piece of paper and write down everything you can think of that makes you grateful that that person is there in any time they were ever useful or helpful to you, and anything nice you can possibly say about them. If you can come from a place of compassion in your heart, that immediately de-escalates the situation. And like I talked about those 5 psychological factors before, the one factor that immediately destroys the link between my feeling of injustice, superiority, distrust, et cetera, and my desire to be hostile to someone else is the sense of a piece of perception of a common humanity, the feeling that we're all in the same boat. You know, and there are ways that I can teach you to identify with that compassion. It involves blessing or praying the person from a spiritual perspective. It involves gratitude. All of those things create positive sentiment. And even though you may think there's nothing positive about that person, if you sit down and force yourself, I'm sure you'll come up with something.
I think we're all recognizing that this all takes work. So I hope we're all willing to do it. So listen, we've got about a minute left. I just want to ask this final question because you've given us practical tactics for resolving current conflict. I'm thinking about, let's go past real quick. Some of us came here today with a situation that happened months ago or even years ago, and it's still bothering us. Ted, is there a statute of limitations, so to speak, on addressing past conflict? In other words, is there time that we just say, let it go? Or, you know, when do we bring it up?
Well, to me, again, it comes back to how much is this bothering you at this point? I mean, and again, has anything changed since this conflict occurred? So for example, if the person has changed and is doing things differently now and it's not an issue anymore, I don't know what the value would be maybe to bring it up, you know, say, well, maybe I do let that go. However, if they're not, or if it's still bothering you at some point, I think it makes sense to have a conversation about it. You know, because we all form stories in our heads about other people and what they did or didn't do. And sometimes that's the biggest barrier to be able to resolve conflict, because we tend to confirm or want to confirm these stories we have in our heads about these people and what they did. So.
Great. Nora, end us off here, minute or less. How do we engage in that conversation that we're talking about with Ted without making the other person feel ambushed if this issue happened a year ago?
Hey, I'm feeling some feelings. They might not sound like they make any sense, but could we schedule a time to talk about these feelings? Because my relationship with you is important to me.
I'm going to use that. I love it. And I appreciate that. Thank you. Oh gosh, we have come on to the hour mark. There's 3 things before we head out, folks. First, I want to sincerely thank our panelists for their time and their incredible insights. And absolutely our audience for your participation, sharing your questions and your ideas. You really have given us reason for being here. So thank you all for that. Secondly, mark your calendars. March 25th, I'll be hosting a webinar on managing up and across, where you can learn techniques for influencing change up the ladder and how to sort of supervise folks that don't report to you. All right, those are going to be some hard conversations. I'm looking forward to that one. Speaking of conversation, it does not have to end here. I encourage you to network with Diana, with Nora, Ted, and me. Reach out for more information, share your progress, and keep in touch. Because when we work together, everyone's mission is possible. Thank you all. See you next time.